Um,
Keep talking.
very good. Peter Ruth has decided to join us today, gracefully. Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
And, he's the solicitor for RAAC. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
And also the voice of the RAAC, legal hotline.
That's correct.
So, that's an added value that you don't get everywhere else, or you have to talk to those people at the Pennsylvania Association of Realtors Legal Hotline. So, you get a little bit more special attention here. I'm done. Peter?
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys for having me. No, it's not like there's, any hot topics going on in the news right now that impact you guys, right? So it's no, but I represent RAAC. I'm an attorney at a law firm called Stock and Leader. We have pretty much service in York, Adams, Cumberland County, Dauphin County, Lancaster County, and can help with a variety of those, but predominantly York and Adams counties for the representation of the Realtors Association. It is where you'll probably have most impact with me. And as I said before, I have a hotline at 717-846-9800. It's our office line for Stock and Leader. So if you call them, let them know it's a hotline. I know I've spoken to several members here, most likely on all topics. It's confidential, so you never have to worry. I'm going to pick up the phone and call the other agent or your broker and say, hey, fire this person immediately, right? No, so it's but at the same time, it's supposed to give you a sense of comfort that you can tell me what you need to tell me so that I can further advise you. So I don't have any weird hours. I know PAR is kind of like morning hours and evening hours and don't call after a certain time. But like I was saying, I have kids, so I don't sleep as much as I'd like to, but I do sleep. So it might not be immediately I get back to you, but normally within like 8 hours, I can get you an answer, at least give you some guidance. So today is predominantly, like I said, the jokes aside, for NAR. So NAR, as you guys know, that's part of your tribe membership. NAR is one of, and not the only national association, but one of many national associations that has what's called a tri-association agreement. So to be a member basically of a local association requires membership of a state association as well as at the national level. So NAR this was, I think, at the end of 2022, was sued by a group of sellers, 500,000 sellers out of Missouri, who basically said what you are doing by sharing compensation cooperatively. And what I mean by that is a seller paying their listing agent based on a listing agreement, and then that seller or listing agent, with permission of the seller, sharing a portion of that with a buyer agent who brings a buyer and closes settlement. So that had been common practice, although not any type of tradition or standard. I would say frequently it happened more often than not. And what these sellers were alleging is that that's not fair. You're not giving us any opportunity to negotiate. You're basically saying that we have to, and I'll use donuts, and we're in a brokerage here, so we can talk about commissions. We're not going to run into antitrust violations because there's no other brokerages who are listening in, hopefully. But in any event, it was 6% was that number, and that's what they alleged in the lawsuit. That habitually, from the time that you can start keeping data until the time that they brought the lawsuit, 6% was what listing agents were charging, and they were sharing 3%. Traditionally, 6% or less, and then could be a 5% or a 2.5% split. So their allegation was that this all was violative of antitrust laws, that we should have more say. The way that NAR was brought in is that NAR had something called the clear cooperation policy, that some could argue prior to the lawsuits, all but required cooperative compensation, or at least disclosing cooperative compensation. NAR has been very triumphant in saying that is, we never required anything. All that we required was that it be disclosed, so that a buyer agent coming in and making an offer knew my fee is going to be covered by the seller or by the listing agent, really, or it's not. And then I'm going to have a conversation with my buyer about that. Now, what MLS, with Bright MLS, if you remember, up until I want to say beginning of August, you were required to put in some type of cooperative compensation, even if it was just $1. It had to be something, couldn't be zero. So they changed that and said, oh no, now it can be zero. You don't have to offer anything. And now they're offering concessions and things like that. So lawsuit is filed. It's litigated. There's a judgment in relatively quick order. I think it was like 3.5 hours. The jury came back with a guilty verdict, or I shouldn't say guilty. Really, it is guilty because we're talking about antitrust laws. But there was a penalty imposed. It could have been to the tune of several billions of dollars. And what NAR did, although they held a meeting, I think it was March when they announced that the settlement. It was a meeting immediately before that. They had been saying, we're going to fight it. Our membership supports it, and we're going to spend the money. And NAR then decided that that was not the case, and they're going to, in fact, settle the lawsuit. So the main keys, and again, if I'm boring you guys, I'll get down to the details, but you have about $400 million that will be paid over, I believe it's 3 years, maybe 5 years, might be confusing those. If you think about it, there's about how many were there? 4 million, I think, or 1 million, I apologize, 1 million members of NAR. So it's about $400 a person when it comes down to that. So not an insurmountable amount of cash or anything like that. But when they did those numbers and they analyzed it based on what those current numbers were, it came down to about $400 a person. However, NAR has said for 2024 and 25, there will be no dues increase. So they will not be increasing your dues to pay for this. That was one of the reasons they wanted to settle it, was because they have cash now that they're able to satisfy this and set it aside. It would put aside all of the uncertainty that comes with litigation, that comes with appeals that are filed. And what they got in exchange for that was the right to continue to offer cooperative compensation. So your listing brokers can still offer cooperative compensation. However, it cannot be anywhere on an association-owned MLS. Okay, so Bright MLS, the ownership of Bright is our association. So RAYAC actually is an owner, owns shares in Bright. So all that means is because the association owns it, nowhere on Bright can you see a reference to cooperative compensation, okay? Shouldn't really see any other reference to seller is incentivized, seller is buyer friendly, things along those lines. Again, I would stay away from. They will be looking for those things. But again, that is just on an MLS. So you can put signage out that says 2.5% cooperative compensation offered. You could put things on a website that does not have any type of IDX feed back or forth with an MLS, an association MLS website. What they don't want you doing is creating websites that are identical to MLS, association MLS linked websites or IDX fed websites where the consumer cannot tell the difference. And I am not an IT person. I'll be the first person to tell you that. But from what I understand, there are ways that you can have two separate websites that basically look identical to the consumer from the outside. And that's what they don't want, because there's no way for them to tell that difference. So anything that's IDX fed should be you got to stay away from it. But again, you can get creative in that when this first came about, there were agents saying, well, I'm going to leave a voicemail, and in all the, 123 Main Street's offering 2.5% cooperative commission, 456 Main Street's offering 1.5%, you know what I mean? Like going through that way, which is crazy to do that. But your promotional literature that you have, if you have an open house, you are free to advertise, hey, we're offering cooperative compensation. Anything on the MLS, though, has to come out. So that's the main rule. That went into effect in August. So hopefully all of you are complying with that. You will see the forms change, and you should be utilizing your new PAR forms that came out, I believe it was the beginning of August, and have been implemented since then. The main change deals with seller concessions, which used to be seller assist, and the cooperative compensation. Cooperative compensation is now going to be negotiated either on the phone, hopefully if the agent picks up the phone, I know how that can be, via text or email, potentially beforehand, or more often than not, I think, especially if you're still seeing multiple offers or situations like that, you're going to have to sift through on a multiple offer comparison sheet and show this one is requesting seller assist, this one is requesting cooperative compensation, this one's requesting both, this one, and it's just going to have to be a new factor in your conversation with your seller about what is the best offer for them. And the whole thing that kind of from the outside looking in doesn't make a lot of sense. The reason this lawsuit was filed was because of transparency. There wasn't enough transparency for what the negotiated fees could be. What the lawsuit has done, one of the elements has taken out the advertisement of cooperative compensation from the MLS, although it's still allowed to be offered. So if you wanted transparency, you've eliminated that aspect of transparency because you no longer will see that, even though they can continue to offer it. So when you figure that out, let me know and we'll all make a lot of money together. But yeah, so that's the head scratcher. So no advertising cooperative compensation in the MLS. The other main change is your buyers must have buyer agency agreements, or not necessarily buyer agency agreements. Let me rephrase that. Must have a written agreement with the broker, the buyer agent, buyer broker, and that agreement must conspicuously and inconspicuously, excuse me, and straightforwardly establish what that amount of compensation is, okay? So buyer agency agreement's very easy. It says broker fee represented by a buyer or represented by a listing agent and their cooperative compensation X% Y dollar amount, not represented X% Y dollar amount. You're explaining to your buyer, hey, if we have cooperative compensation and they're offering, I'll use the hypothetical, 6 donuts, and we have a buyer agency agreement that says you're going to pay me 3 donuts, and I'm getting those 3 donuts from that listing agent, then you're not paying me anything in that situation. But same hypothetical, they're offering 2 donuts. You've agreed to pay me 3 donuts. In that instance, I'm going to collect the 2 and I'm going to ask you, buyer, to make up that 1 donut, right? And the same thing applies now. Let's say you've agreed to 2.5 donuts and you have a listing broker who's offering 3 donuts. You are not allowed to take all 3 donuts without going back to your buyer agency agreement and modifying that. Okay. Now, I would also be very careful when you're doing that. I think if the real estate commission or the powers that be who are overseeing this start to see that pattern, and I really think the pattern would be you have a listing agreement that says 0%. You get an offer, they're offering cooperative compensation of, let's say, 3%, 2.5%, whatever. Now you modify your buyer agency agreement to say, okay, now it's going to be 2.5% that I get. That is where, to a consumer, you're telling that consumer most likely my services are free. Don't worry about it. And that's not what the commission wants to see happen. So you are free. Just to be clear, if you're only getting 2.5% on your buyer agency agreement and the listing agreement is offering cooperative compensation at 3%, you are allowed to get that additional 0.5%. As long as the buyer agency agreement has been modified before closing and signed with informed consent. Now, if you look at the PAR forms, the way that transaction's supposed to go, you see, hey, I'm only at 2.5%, they're offering 3%. You're supposed to call the listing broker first and say, there's this 0.5% there. Is there any way I can use that to the benefit of my buyer? Are you willing to drop 0.5% off the purchase price? Will you do 0.5% of additional closing cost assistance or anything like that? Ordinarily, what does that mean? It means that, if they're not collecting that, or if you're not getting that 0.5%, who's going to get it? The listing broker, right? So are they really going to be incentivized to say, oh yeah, and maybe they will, maybe they won't, maybe the lender won't allow that to happen. But in either event, what you're supposed to do first is try to utilize that to your buyer's advantage. More often than not, I think the reality is that the seller or the listing broker is going to say, no, it's either you're taking that 0.5% or I'm going to take it because I've agreed to share up to 3%. If you're only allowed to take 2.5%, then that's between you and your buyer. So in that instance, you can go back to your buyer and say, hey, buyer, we've tried. We were unsuccessful to get that money to you. But is it okay if I get that extra 0.5%? That's what we've agreed, the listing agent has offered, and there's no way that I can get that money into you. That is okay. What you can't do, though, is simply take the extra 0.5% without modifying your buyer agency agreement. You've now accepted a commission other than what was in that buyer agency agreement. Okay, so that's the main thing. I think the thing you also start to see more or less are these things called touring agreements, and you might have heard a lot about that. That was a huge deal at NAR. We are dealing with, NAR is trying to triumph the efforts of buyer agency and say there is value in what these folks are doing, despite what you read in the media, despite what everybody's saying is, oh, you don't need an agent anymore. And I love when you saw in the media, agents are no longer required, or sellers are no longer required to pay for buyer agent. They've never been required to do that. That's never been the actuality. But in any event, that's what you're up against. That's your lovely media for you. But so when you're having those discussions, again, we are trying to say all the benefits that buyer agency brings with representation, with knowledge, with access to resources. Oh, I need a home inspection. Who do I call? Do I just Google that? Well, here's our, a referral list for you. Pick anyone. Here's a lender list. Oh, you need a special loan product, or here's a special loan product available to you because you're a veteran, or you have an ag property or something. That's the benefit of buyer agency, and that's what we try to promote. Get a buyer agency agreement. Don't do a touring agency, whatever it is, but I refer to it as a pendulum. The opposite side of that is, as a solicitor, as an association, we should be supportive of all legal business models, right? And that is a legal business model, is having a buyer agency, or gotta stop saying that, having an agreement with a buyer before you take them into the property. And I've seen some of them through Zillow. They've been forwarded to my attention. What they do is they say, the term of this is a day, a week, however long they want to have it, could be specific to a property. I'm going to give you access. Once I give you access and we leave, my service is over, okay? If you want to go back and see it, you're going to call me again. We'll fill out a new touring agreement. If you want to make an offer, you're going to call me. We'll sit down and do a buyer agency agreement. But my service to you is done once we leave those doors. And if you want to negotiate with that seller directly, have at it. But I've earned my fee for showing you the property. So does it kind of devalue what buyer agency can offer? Yes. But I think we also have to be cognizant there's going to be competing business models, just like there always have been. You know, the transaction licensee has been a thing for a while where, oh, you just want this form? Here you go, pay me $100 and you get a copy of the ASR, you get a copy of this. And so it's going to be embracing that. And now realizing that as a listing agent, when you get that question, well, I don't want you to share cooperative compensation, okay? That's fine, all right, well, and then the next logical question is, well, if you're not required to share anything, should I be paying you less, right? Because ordinarily, if I'm giving you 6%, you would only get 3% in a transaction where you're sharing it. Shouldn't I then pay you less if I'm not offering that cooperative compensation? Logically, I think that question will come up. And I think you have to realize and be ready to explain to your sellers, especially, my job most likely just got harder now, because a buyer who may want a seller to pay that for them may not now want to see your property. And even if they see the property, they may not want to write an offer because they're not in a position to be able to afford that buyer broker fee. So they're now either going to ask you for a seller concession, which is going to come off your purchase price, which is fine if you want to handle it that way. But please don't think that my job is getting any less involved because we're not offering buyer broker compensation. In fact, it might now be more involved because I'm going to have a buyer who's like, well, I want to write an offer. Okay, we'll write an offer. Well, where do I get the form? Oh, well, okay. You call your seller. I'm going to give them a form. Is that okay? Yeah, sure. So you send off a form. You get it back and there's blanks and there's things missing. And they said they wanted financing, but that whole thing is, well, now you're going to have to what? Sit down with the buyer or try to get your client. You're trying to get the sale for the seller, right? How do you navigate that without giving this buyer the impression that you represent them as well? How do you tell them to a certain extent, like, buddy, it's up to you to go figure this stuff out, right? You're not paying me, I don't represent you. But at the same time, the reality is you're working on behalf of your seller to get the property sold. So if you don't provide the service, aren't you standing in the way of that? So it's going to be a weird kind of like figure this whole thing out. And I joke, it's kind of like the ocean where the waves are coming up and we're just kind of like, oh, okay, all right, everything's all right. Like, but it's going to be a while of that. And I think people are still getting used to that. So just be aware, as a listing agent, it's not up to you all to be policing this. So you're not standing there at the gate before your open houses or listing, the showings and saying, buyer agency, let me see it, make sure you have all that stuff. There's no liability for you all as the listing broker or the listing agent if people are getting into the property to see it without. Really, it's on that agent who's violating the law at this point and allowing somebody into the property without having that written agreement. So that's really the main thing. I mean, for what I joke, I shouldn't say, if you were practicing with the forms we had the correct way, nothing has really changed other than you need that buyer agency agreement before you go in. And what I will say, even before this lawsuit happened, if you didn't have a buyer agency agreement with a buyer and you took them into a property, legally, you were working for the seller. So any information you gave to that buyer about how to craft an offer, how to do this or that, may have been an ethical violation because you're disclosing things that are really you owe your fiduciary duty to the seller through the listing agent as a sub-agent of that listing agent for the seller. So although you never were required to have it, legally, you were pretty much in the same position that hey, you have no protection here. You're working on behalf of the seller. That was always the best tool, I thought, up until you now say you have to have it to say, this is why we should sign buyer agency, because if we don't, I'm representing the seller. I can't really talk to you about will the seller accept less? What if we offer seller financing? What if we do this or that? I can't answer any of those questions until we have buyer agency together. So I get it. It's an awkward conversation, especially this day and age. It's like, hey, I want to meet you on Saturday at noon and then see the house at 12:30. And it's like, well, how do you explain this? So that's where I think touring agreements may have some benefit there, but they should be used as like a last ditch effort to maintain that. Again, I defer to your broker. I'm not giving you any practice other than the legal aspect of it, but trying to preserve that relationship without letting them get out the door. But then that whole time, I think emphasizing to them, unless we do this buyer agency, our relationship is over after this. So
I
we need
agree.
to, yeah.
100%.
That's it. So make sure we do that, make sure we're talking about that, having that dialogue with them. But then really, I think it's up to you. And the best agents, I think, are going to be the ones who get creative with it and really show while you're doing that tour, oh, and if we do sign the buyer agency agreement, this is what we can do. And this is how I can help you, explaining to them the compensation, explaining to them cooperative sharing, and how even if they're not offering cooperative compensation, depending on where the market is, we might be able to ask them to pay for that as a seller assist. So just don't say, I don't want to go see properties where there's not cooperative compensation, because we can negotiate around that, right? But that, again, it's all about how I think you pitch it and how creative you can get with it.
Yes, so I think that's the one thing that the requirement to have a agency relationship or a buyer agency or a non-exclusive buyer agency, it doesn't leave space for a skittish buyer who's new to the process, who doesn't understand what they don't know.
Yes,
And
exactly.
that so many of us have, had that situation where I'm showing you this house and trying to get them to understand that I'm here for you as an advocate, not to try and sell you this property.
Right, exactly.
And that's what that touring agreement can allow.
Exactly, yeah.
It's
and
an audition period.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like a little honeymoon before, or I guess no, the honeymoon's too late. Yeah. So it's the courtship before the marriage. But yeah, that's right. But it is, and it's all in how you use it, I think. And that's it. Really, the first time agents who I think haven't honed that skill, that interaction, or that ability to kind of talk with the client or consumer, it's going to be tough for them, because I think if they're just getting access to the property and they're not able to engage, and they're not able to kind of, I don't want to say pitch, but to reinforce the benefits of buyer agency, that's all they're going to do. And they'll be like, all right, thank you. And honestly, they might just then call the listing agent. And that's what I frequently would see happening. And then say, hey, we'd like to write an offer. We don't have an agent. So that's where I think it's, reminding them that, yeah, you could contact listing agent directly, but you're going to have a professional working for them and no professional working for you. And this is probably the most amount of money you've ever paid for anything in your entire life, right? This is the most high value asset you're ever going to own until you sell and buy another asset. And express to them some of the pitfalls of, hey, we can talk about getting an inspection. And if you just think about waiving, here are kind of the pros and the cons in that. And this is how, and I have access to these resources and things like that. It's a newer agent, I think, unless they're kind of that diamond in the rough, is going to have a hard time doing that unless they see other agents who are able to do that. So, but I agree with you completely. This is not something where I think any brokerage should be drawing a line in the sand saying, we have buyer agency agreements or we have nothing, and we'll do this and that. It's, let's be adaptive with business models. Let's make sure we're fully disclosing, that there's a relationship beyond this if you want to, but this is the fee that's being paid and this is how it's paid. And as long as you're okay with that. And my other thing is giving that away for free. That's up to you guys. That's your decision, but you can collect a non-refundable amount as a fee, right? And even in your regular listing agreements, buyer agency agreements, you can collect a non-refundable amount up front. So listing agreements are a great example. You're going to shell out money probably for photos. You're going to shell out money, and I have clients or referral sources who do this for a storage place because they don't have the money right now in the family and they need to get the stuff out to store it, to stage the house. So they'll maybe pay a month or two for a storage fee. And now all of a sudden the buyer's like, well, or the seller, excuse me, says, I just don't want to sell. I want to take the property off the market. If your listing agreement doesn't say that you're allowed to be reimbursed for those expenses, and the seller simply says, no, I'm not paying you anything, you're out that money. There's no way you can get that. And I've had cases where more recently, many brokerages used to negotiate an out. They would say, hey, pay back our out of pockets and we release you from the contract and you can list with somebody else whenever you want. if you're doing that, but you don't have that collection in your listing agreement, guess who's now collected a fee that was other than what was disclosed in the underlying listing agreement? So now it's a real estate commission issue. Now it's a violation of the lawsuit potentially. So you have to be really careful in that. But I think to that point, even if you're doing the non-exclusive buyer agency or whatever it is, or even an exclusive for that, you can put in there, I'm going to be spending my weekends, my weeknights, taking you out to see all of these properties. No matter what happens, I'm getting X number of dollars. But how do you have that conversation though with someone who's a little skittish and doesn't really want to pay much of anything to do that? But my advice is always for your touring agreements, you should at least get like $100 or something. I mean, there should be some compensation for you all. Nothing is set in standard. Obviously, nothing is the industry-wide standard, but I know Zillow has been pushing these $0, I'll get you in the house. And then basically it's up to the agent to spin their services to try to get that, the afterwork, so to speak, of actually representing them.
And I think it's super interesting, like 5 years ago, there wasn't a whole lot of discussion around that.
None. Yeah, absolutely.
But it takes something like this to move the whole market
Yep.
forward where everybody's like, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I don't even know, like you said, we're riding the waves here, trying to figure out where everything settles in, or as I said, a high school dance where everybody's trying to figure out where they put their feet.
Exactly.
Like, I think a lot of people, once it starts happening more commonly,
Mhm.
I think it's the whole market's gonna say, all right, this is right, there should be a retainer
Yeah.
or
Oh, I
something.
think so. Yeah. I mean, it's going to take some getting used to. There, even with the forms, and that's the other thing is like the agents are not understanding, and honestly, some brokers are not understanding the seller assist versus and the concession versus the actual cooperative compensation. So I had one where my office, I think we were representing the estate, who was the seller. And we were utilizing an agent who the executor of the estate was friends with, and that agent, very well seasoned, I'm not going to out any names, wasn't at this brokerage though. Signed a listing agreement at, let's say, 6 donuts, whatever it was. And then it was right around the time when the forms changed, and then markets the property. She had an offer from a buyer client of hers. So she's dual agent on this. So she puts in the agreement of sale about the seller assist of 3%. And then she has the seller cooperative compensation also at 3%. So I'm thinking, wait a minute here, if you're collecting 6%, this means that technically the seller is on the hook for 9% because it's 6% they're paying you plus a 3% seller assist that they're giving directly to the buyer agent, so to speak, or to the buyer. So you have to be very careful. And we went back and forth, and I called this agent and they were telling me, well, no, my broker said to fill it out that way. It was like, have your broker call me. Broker didn't want to call me, I know. So I got a call back from the agent. They were basically like, well, we can see both sides of it, and just said, okay. And we knew, I said, you just need to confirm, and we were representing the seller. So really it was my client. Confirm for my client, you are charging her 6%, and that's it. And she said, yes, that is it. That's what we have in our fee agreement. So we settled that one, but this is an agent who's been doing this for 30 plus years, and just this new form change. And it's like this whole Chicken Little, oh my Lord, it's this changes the industry. Like I said before, if you've been doing it the right way, the only thing you're not going to see now is that offer of compensation. And it's going to be more important you have your buyer agency or some touring agreement before you go into a property. That's it. So
Peter, one of the difficult parts is where we have a listing agreement and the seller thought it was a good idea to incentivize buyer traffic by offering cooperating broker compensation.
Yep.
So let's just say hypothetically it was 6% and 3% to a buyer's agent. Where we have a situation where there's a buyer's agent whose brokerage policy is that they don't accept cooperating brokerage compensation.
yes.
Now we are doing a change in terms to our listing agreement to accommodate that change.
Yeah.
And that gets a little bit tricky. And that's one of the reasons why sitting in on a bunch of roundtables with brokers and people at Bright, I really see that cooperating brokerage compensation could have numbered days in
I agree with you.
Pennsylvania.
Yeah,
I think that's.
Yes, the DOJ, who is litigating a whole bunch of lawsuits now, they had West Penn, I can't remember I think it's West Penn, but they were out in like the Pittsburgh area. They were sued. They are not an association-owned MLS. They are, I think, a broker-owned MLS. So as a result of that, they're not governed by the terms of this lawsuit. But they have a lawsuit that's pending against them. And what the DOJ has said on the record and several times in pleadings is that their goal is to get rid of the ability of a seller to cooperatively compensate the buyer agent. They want to see that gone. They want the buyer to pay for their services and the seller to pay for their services. And that's a cost that the buyer needs to factor in when they're looking at what they can afford in the market and looking at a home. So I agree with you completely. I think it's going to be a thing of the past. That was one of NAR's main reasons to settle, I think, is that writing was on the wall.
Yeah.
And this preserved the ability for that to continue to happen.
And got it closer to what
Yep.
DOJ is shooting for.
Correct.
And kind of
makes
us a lower profile target.
What I think they honestly did was they simply added a few, well, maybe miles, some runway to a plane that is landing, being that cooperative compensation. Once it lands, it goes away. And I think what they've done is they basically extended a little bit to say, okay, we have a little more time to land this thing, knowing and prepare our agents for the fact that this is not going to be there for much longer.
I mean,
10 years, I would say. I mean, anything in this world takes a long time, but I would say 5 to 10 years, and we may be in that position, or just in a position where the market is not bearing buyer brokers being compensated by the seller through the listing agent.
I mean, with all the calls I take as a broker where everybody's like, all right, now let me get this right. And we're trying to figure out like, all right, now we have a buyer's agent who's getting paid from 3 buckets. Maybe we're getting 1% on cooperating.
Yep.
We're getting 1% on the agreement of sale, and we're getting 1% from buyer agency to pay a buyer's agent.
Correct.
It seems like the long way around to take commission from the seller to the seller's agent to the buyer's agent,
Yep.
buyer's brokerage.
Mhm.
And it just seems, it becomes more evident with all those different hurdles that it's easier just to get rid of it.
I would agree with you in the long term, but I think in the short term, that's one rug you can't just yank out from people given the time and the history of it.
Yep.
And I think the other, to your point, the complicating factor is going to be if you have agreed, we'll say 6% on a listing broker fee, you have multiple offers, some of which are offering cooperative compensation or we're asking for it, some of which aren't. And it gets even better. The one that is not asking for the cooperative compensation, what if that's your dual agent and you're acting as the agent for that one as well? So now it's like, oh, well, I don't need it because it's me and I'm getting a full, and there's all the, how do you navigate that? And that's where unfortunately, and I know I hate to say it, and hopefully none of you are like this, but more and more, I just taught new member orientation this morning, actually at RAAC, and then drove over here. More and more people just don't want to talk to each other. They don't want to pick up the phone. They'll just shoot an email to communicate. But this is one where if your client says, well, we'll just pick the one that's best, whatever gets the most money for me. It's like, well, look, it's not that simple. You're going to get the same amount of money. The thing that's going to be different though, is that I'm going to get more money in one scenario, or I'm going to get less in another. And you'll be compensating this other broker. So maybe it's not modifying or lowering what your broker fee is for the seller, but letting them know that, hey, if you take this one, I get everything. If you take this one, you get the same amount, but I share half of that. I have no interest whatsoever in which one you want. They're all, and assuming they are identical, but what if they're not? Now, how do you factor that? This one wants an inspection, this one doesn't. That's just something, as long as you've disclosed it with your seller and let them decide. But to your point, that's another easy way to kind of keep agents out of trouble, is don't even let it get a part of that. You know what I mean? Don't even bring it into the equation. Take that out. We know that the buyer is going to compensate their agent. We know the seller is going to compensate their agent if they want to use one. Again, not obligated to do that. Whatever they work out in terms of compensation, let them work that out. But it will have no impact on the offer other than by way of like a seller concession or something along those lines. So yeah, it's going to get your jobs are not getting easier. I mean, they never are, but your jobs are definitely not getting any easier in light of the changes that they have. So.
I have 2 questions.
Go ahead.
First question is, are we able to tell a seller that it is harder for a buyer? It's harder for them if they are not offering a co-broke. Essentially, it's lessening traffic.
Yeah, so I wouldn't jump to that assumption that it's going to be harder to sell that. I think you have to explain to them the pros and the cons, and you explain to them in this fashion that a buyer unlike a seller who has this pool of money, hopefully, that they're gonna be able to just take out of, oh yeah, throw in a home warranty, it's just coming out of my bottom dollar. The buyer's not like that. The buyer is gonna have a limited pool of resources. There's going to be certain things. Now, VA has changed, so they are allowing the seller to compensate or the buyer to pay for their broker fee and still qualify for the VA loan. But there are gonna be buyers who unfortunately just can't afford that. And I think they've come to expect that, rightly or wrongly. So it's explaining to the seller, here are the pros, here are the cons. And you can draw on your experience and say, hey, I've done X number of deals in the last year. Of those number of deals, this number have offered cooperative compensation, this number haven't. My experience has been that the ones that have offered it might sit on the market longer. Maybe it's the opposite. The ones that don't offer it are the ones sitting on the market longer. But that has nothing to do. That's just one item, one facet in that whole thing. So I think it is not saying you're going to get less traffic if you don't offer cooperative compensation. It is saying, I can't tell you as I sit here today if that's a good idea or a bad idea, but what I can tell you is the pros are buyers who can't afford to otherwise buy your house unless you're paying that fee are going to come see your house. The cons are, you know, hey, you're paying for someone else to do a job for someone else, right? Like I'm paying for my competition's professional here. That's not right. That's like me paying my a defendant's attorney when I'm suing them. How is that? A little bit less, but so that's, I think, weighing those two options and then allowing them to make the decision. But be ready. I mean, I always put these things out there, and everyone's like, oh yeah, that's good. The reality is they're going to ask you. The very next question is, well, what's typical, right? What's common? What do you see most often? And that's where you have to say, there is no typical, there is no common. Here's from my experience, but you're allowed to choose. You're allowed to say yes, you're allowed to say no, you're allowed to say whatever you want. But that, I think it is not saying this is a bad idea. This is an idea, this is one option. Here's maybe some reasons you do want to do it. Here's some reasons you don't want to do it, but the decision is yours.
And then second question is, who and how is the contract before showing going to be enforced?
So that's a good question. I imagine it's a court order. So there's legal oversight from the court that is enforcing this. It's a violation of the court order to be showing homes without the touring agreement or some other type of written agreement. So technically it would be contempt of court that they would bring you in on. It likely would also be potentially some type of licensure issue, I'm not sure. But likely it would be by the court's contempt powers by saying you are not operating within the realms that you're legally able to. And then you would probably lose your inclusion from the release that they offer to all of the members of NAR and everyone else.
At a brokerage level.
Could be. It also, I mean, if it's an agent and you're looking at that and it's like a one-time thing, I would hope that this is going to be more of an educational process rather than like a vindictive, you know, we're going to punish you for doing this. But I would imagine if there were habitual offenses that went unaddressed at a brokerage, that yes, it would go to the broker level. Keeping in mind the broker is responsible for oversight. I mean, that's where it will come down to. So it may not be, it's not going to be every agent in the brokerage unless every agent's doing it, but likely they'll go after that agent as well as the broker who is responsible for the oversight of that agent. This would need to be for pretty egregious violations, right? So for example, repeatedly going into a buyer or a seller's home with a buyer without having that buyer agency agreement, without having something, right? You did it one time, you thought it was included, it was omitted, whatever. They're going to say, hey, make sure you do that. Let's audit your files, make sure the other ones are in compliance and go from there. But I think if they see a pattern, they are out for blood, I think is a good way to put it. This is not, they think, okay, the last thing that the plaintiffs want is for the defense to think that they've signed this lawsuit and now it's back to business as usual. So I think I won't go as far as saying there's going to be like little plants walking around finding out like, oh, I don't want to sign an agreement. Can you take me in the house though, really quickly? You know, maybe not. I will say that I think it was in Pennsylvania they were doing that for FHA violations, where they would have people of protected classes going out, clearly stating or plainly identifiable that they were members of protected classes to try to catch people in these, oh, well, I can't show you this community because of XYZ reasons, or you know, you're not going to fit in this community, so let's go look at it. So it's not out of the realm of the ordinary, but I would hope there's going to be some leniency with the transition and the understanding. You all are, I would say, in good stead. Your brokerage has taken an active interest, at least to have someone come out and talk to you. I'm sure you've had other classes, educational opportunities. There are some brokerages that I go into, not last week, the week before, where the look of astonishment when I'm going over these requirements is just like, it's heartbreaking almost, because you're like, so no one has at all talk, like you haven't sat in on one seminar. NAR has a ton of good resources, even if you're not getting it here, which I know you are. But if you forget, or, you know, hey, I'm running out of time, I want to watch it from home, log on to NAR. They have all the ways you can talk about buyer agency, the ways of compliance, you know, why did we settle the lawsuit and things like that. So a lot of good, valuable resources, but I think you're going to see those fly-by-nighters. You know, the majority of realtors in the first 4 years, I think it's like 60 to 70% who've been in the industry for 4 years or less drop out after about 4 years. So we have a lot of young members here at RAYAC, which I think to a certain extent is good. It's good to have young blood. The average realtor, I think, is like a 55 to 57-year-old woman. So having younger membership is not necessarily a bad thing. Not that 55, 57 is old, but having, you know, a lot of younger members, though, may not be that great, because you have a lot of younger people coming in who may not make it. And then they're going to drop off, and that's what you're left with. So it's going to be a matter of availing yourself of the opportunities. And I will say to that vein, you're going to hear a lot of conflicting things, right? Like I was at this NAR seminar, and there were attorneys who were barking at each other about how they're wrong and no, I'm right, and this, that, and the other. And it's their attorneys, the most brilliant of legal minds in this profession, about this profession, who are fighting with one another about what the lawsuit says, what you can do, what you can't do. It's going to be crazy for the next few years, I think, until everything settles down. And then once it does, hopefully we hit that path of normalcy and it's more business as usual. But yeah, it's your industry will be changing. Definitely in the next year, the next 2 to 5 years, most definitely it's going to be pretty impactful, I think.
So you brought up the point about discrepancies, squabbles over
Yeah.
what's right, what's wrong. What do you hear about clear cooperation? Because that seems to be the new one that the heavyweights at the top are duking out.
Yeah. So I mean, to me, to the point we were talking about before, it's going to get so murky that I think the proponents of that are going to get tired of continually defending it, and they're going to cave and get rid of it. But I mean, right now, I think the way that NAR spun, the way I read the clear cooperation policy from NAR prior to this was you had to offer. I mean, I think there were many scholars, that's why the jury came out the way that they did. The way that they were able to spin it to now sit, and I don't want to say spin, but to kind of craft that message so that it is more, we've never required it, we just required you to disclose what that is, if at all. That goes away, right? I mean, it's not disclosed unless you ask. So
Right.
I mean, there is no cooperation. Now, I think the harder part of our ethics rules are going to have to be written, because a lot of what, like Article 16, for example, talks about negotiating for a commission or paying a commission, cooperative compensation, less than what was offered in the MLS. Well, it's not going to be offered in the MLS anymore. So how do you deal with that? But I would likely see that whole policy is going to shift away, or just be completely recrafted into, if you say you're going to offer it, honor it type deal. And and again, I don't know how you would modify that.
Yeah.
So interesting.
So clear cooperation was, you know, if you're assisting somebody selling a property, has to be advertised, basically. And you have to
Yep.
offer compensation. And now some of the bigwigs are saying that limits the flexibility that a seller client has available to them. If they don't want to advertise it, they shouldn't have to advertise it.
Right.
And so that's where it is.
And you can do, so you've always been able, especially with Bright, you can do office exclusives or broker exclusives. You can list it off MLS. This was predominantly used for like very high profile. I know in like California, New York, if celebrities, a lot of times they don't want everybody to know, they don't want somebody to come in and take pictures or to have the pictures publicly available. But the hard part is that necessarily in the best interest of your client? And that's what I think NAR tries to grapple with is, although that is a good business model, just like our touring agreement, used in the right way, that's a great tool to have. But I think we're going off on a little bit of a limb to say all agents will only use that for good. And what I think was happening is non-advertisement ends up in, oh, you're a dual agent all of a sudden. You have the buyer and the seller, or somebody in your office has both sides of the transaction. You didn't advertise it. Had you advertised it, I have 9 buyers who would have made an offer at or above asking price. Is that in the best interest of the seller? And again, this is the hard part. There is no policy that you can come up with that's going to satisfy everyone. Because maybe to me as a seller, my husband just passed away, or my wife or whomever, my brother who lived with me just passed away. I don't want people coming into my house to show it, right? I don't want to have to pack up my stuff and get out. I know and I trust my agent who says that they have a buyer who loves my house, don't need to do anything. They don't want inspections, and they're just going to write an offer for what I think is fair. And I talk to my family about it, and they say, yeah, it seems like a fair offer. That is in that seller's best interest then, right? At least from that seller's perspective, to not go through the listing, to not have it advertised on the MLS, to not have to put up with showings, or to have because again, it's not just going to be those who want to buy. You're going to have all the neighbors who want to come in and look, and the nosy, and so it's hard to come up with that. But I think 9 times out of 10, what the market will show is that putting property on the market, exposing it to the market, allowing for multiple offers, is only going to be in that seller's best interest typically. So that's the hard part. But we are not, this isn't communist Russia. We can't tell everybody, hey, this is in your best interest, you must do it, right? And this is, hey, there's pros to this, just like having it on the MLS, or putting it, offering cooperative compensation or not. There's pros, there's cons. Let's figure out what works best for your situation. I think helping them get to that answer is where you all are going to have a lot of value coming up here. So, good question.
What about, what's up with Alabama?
With Alabama,
Yeah,
with
they pulled out of NAR.
oh yes, yeah, the state association. Yeah, they're all well, and it's funny. So Alabama did that. Yeah, Alabama's all. And if everybody saw, NAR's chief counsel Katie Johnson stepped down beginning of October. Katie I met several times, phenomenal person, just very bright. So I think they are finally starting to feel the pressure of, why did you settle the lawsuit? Why did we not fight it a little bit more? Yeah, Alabama has basically decided that they no longer want to. They no longer see a benefit in service and counsel, and just doesn't want to be involved with NAR. This was, I don't want to say discussed at PAR. The ongoings out in the community have been discussed, but I don't think there's any incentive or inclination for PAR to do that. Although I will say, I'm not going to name the member. I do get frequent calls on why are we as a local association also encouraging membership with not just NAR, but with PAR. And a lot of members I know feel like they've been stabbed in the back, that NAR just didn't have any gumption to try to proceed with the lawsuit. They felt like they caved pretty much, but I think a lot of that is stemming from that. I mean, and not to mention, NAR has had a lot of black eyes recently with some sexual harassment stuff. PAR had a very similar thing that went on. So I think it's trying to, it's a cost benefit at the end of the day. Is it worth being associated and affiliated with this when we have to comply with all this stuff? They're the reason. I think a lot of associations view that they were in the lawsuit, and had there been better planning, better action, that might have ended a different way. All of which is Monday morning quarterbacking, and you can expect to have. But yeah, it's a sentiment that definitely has made its way here. But what I will say is, sitting at the board meetings at RAAC, we still see a lot of benefits to NAR for the guidance perspective, but also to PAR, and for the forums that they offer, for a lot of the guidance that they can give us.
So do I. I mean,
yeah,
just
yeah. Hank Lerner is great. They are looking for new outside counsel, I think it is. So it used to be what is his name? I just forgot it. I can't remember. It's going to come to me in a second. He was at Meddy Evans. He had been there. Yes, Jim Goldsmith. Yes, I was thinking Goldberg. I'm like, it's not Goldberg. Yeah, Jim Goldsmith, who had been there for almost
Yeah.
40 years, I think. So I think he had been retired, I think, just not officially. But I think he's officially out. They sent out an RFP for new counsel. Brett Woodburn's always been involved heavily there. He's a good attorney as well. But yeah, I think it is unknown what real estate's going to look like here in the next few years. And I think the hardest part for those associations is going to be dealing with member strife at what's going on, that of which they have no control, right? I mean, it's not like NAR asked us. In fact, we had a meeting with Shauna Toroso will tell you, they had a meeting with NAR, all the association executives, the day before they announced the settlement of the lawsuit. Not once did it come up. They were saying about how they're going to fight it to the end. They're going to do this, that, and the other. And then the next day there's an announcement. Maybe not the next day, but a very short time later. So again, the Alabama leaving, I understand, I think, a little bit why there is some frustration, but lawsuits make people do crazy things, especially organizations. And that's, that's just the reality.
Do you mind if we step aside from the NAR
Let's do
settlement?
it, yeah.
Hang on, real quick, one last question. If we get a tour agreement signed and the buyer decides to see another home with you prior to hiring and siring a buyer agency, should they get another tour agreement signed, or does the original work from what?
Depends on the tour agreement.
Yep, that's exactly right. Depends on that. You could say, this is going to apply to any property that I take you to see. And then you just want to be clear, if you are charging a fee, is that all-inclusive? It's let's say $500 will take you to see as many properties as you want. Is it $100 per property? But as long as that is all hammered out in those touring agreements, then that's what you're looking for. The other thing to keep in mind, PAR does not have a form for any type of touring agreement that I'm aware of yet. They have not developed that. So that would be something you're looking at a brokerage level to do, or consultation with your brokerage counsel to basically come up with that, to make sure, again, definite term, definite amount of being charged, make sure it has that clear end date and things like that. But to that question, needs to have, dependent on what that touring agreement actually says. Shifting gears, all right.
So Pennsylvania passed some of their own legislation not too long ago regarding wholesaling.
That's correct.
I have not had the opportunity to sit down and read that.
Yep.
What's it?
I have.
What's it? I'm banking on.
Yeah, so basically, wholesaling, as I'll describe it, is just so everyone's on the same page, because I know some people have different perceptions. This is not where you're getting like 90 properties all at once for like a discount price. Wholesaling, as this term is referring to it, is kind of what's called like taking an equitable interest or conveying and selling an equitable interest in property. The way it works, let's say that Joe down the street has a property for sale. Peter Ruth comes in and says, "Hey, Joe, really like your property. What I'd like to do is, it needs a little bit of work. Maybe you're delinquent on taxes. Maybe you need some help to do some other stuff. I will agree that I will buy your house. We're going to enter into an agreement that you're going to sell the house for no less, and you will accept, let's say, $100,000. Okay. Now, Joe, keep in mind, because of the condition, I'm going to have to shell out some money here, right? I'm going to have to maybe pay your taxes to make sure it doesn't go to tax sale. I'm going to have to, pay off some mortgage stuff so it doesn't get into foreclosure. But I'm going to spend some money. I'm going to fix it up. And I then, with your permission, this is hopefully the way it worked. This is not always the way it worked. Hopefully, with your permission, owner, Joe, I will market this property to a third party, right? Without ever going to settlement with you. I never take title in my own name, right? I never get a deed. I never do anything. I just have an agreement of sale with Joe that says, I will do these certain things. Joe is going to get no less than, or at maximum, he's going to get $100,000 at closing. But what I am able to do is to market my interest as the buyer to another buyer. I can wholesale it. Another buyer will basically say, "Oh, Peter Ruth has an agreement with Joe. I'm going to go in there and basically buy out that equitable interest." Now, I'm not just going to swap out, right? As Peter Ruth, I don't make money that way. So I want to make back the money that I put into the home by paying the taxes, by paying for all the improvements, paying the mortgage, anything I'm out of pocket, any holding costs that I have. And then I also want a little bit on top, right? Because I rehabbed this building. I did some nice things to it. So ordinarily we'll say, hey, I will now sell the property for $175,000 to this third party. Joe has agreed he's going to show up at closing, but all he's getting is $100,000. And then I'm going to get that 75 or whatever that net is after we pay the transfer tax and do everything else. We have agreed that Joe authorizes the closing company to disperse that excess money to me. because that's our agreement, right? There's all sorts of red flags that go off, right? Like, why would Joe not just deal with his buyer directly to get the 175,000? And when you're there as a title agent and you're explaining this, like, and Joe has to sign the HUD saying that the property is selling for 175,000, right? So it's like, well, wait, I'm not getting 175, I'm getting 100. But so if this was not explained in the correct way to Joe, obviously Joe is going to be a little confused and upset, most likely, with why is this person getting more money than I am, right? So what the law now says is that you're allowed to do that as long as you have a real estate license. You have to have a real estate license to be that wholesaler, to market that equitable interest, right? And more importantly, there's a right of rescission that applies. There's a 30-day right of rescission on that contract between Joe and me as that equitable interest owner.
Wow.
So when I approach Joe, I can say, hey, Joe, I'm going to buy your property for 100. I'm going to see what I can sell it for. The smart investor now is not going to do anything for 30 days until after that 30-day time period has expired. Okay. So that's the real issue. What was happening in reality is people were going out, hey, I'll buy your property for $100,000. Okay. They would never hear from that person again until they finally contacted them and say, okay, it's time to go to closing. So they'd show up to closing. There'd be somebody else sitting across the settlement table from them. They'd pass them the HUD that says they're selling the property for $200,000. And they'd be sitting there and saying, and Joe would say, I agreed to sell it to 100,000 to some other person who's not here. Who's getting the extra 100? Who's doing the, none of this was likely explained to Joe. So now Joe really has no idea. He could have done something different.
Or there was a power of attorney signed,
Could be.
giving that investor the right to sign on their behalf. I've seen things done in trusts,
Yeah.
where they just swap out the trustee.
Yep.
I like that there's a right of rescission there. What I don't understand exactly is how this is going to comport with the code of ethics.
Yeah.
And how do they reconcile this basically amounting to a net listing commission?
Yeah. I mean, well, that's a good question. I'm not,
So
and honestly, if it's going to be in the MLS, that's the other thing. I don't know if a lot of these are going to be advertised that way, because many of them are advertised among like a wholesaler, I'll call it like a network, where it's not really any MLS advertisement. It's just, hey, I know a guy who's willing to come in to do this. I think the main thing though, if you are advertising it, you're going to have to work out how you're being compensated. The way I really viewed it working was like it's a real estate licensee who's acting as the investor, doing the work and then marketing the interest on behalf of the seller. But I think the complicating factor comes in, if I'm just a wholesaler, but I want to use you to market my equitable interest, working that out will require permission from Joe, our original seller. And the compensation, it will almost have to have like a buy-in from him in terms of what,
and Bright doesn't allow
No.
marketing of equitable interest.
Correct. Yeah.
So technically a wholesale in this fashion or a novation can't be marketed that.
That's right. That's right. Yep. So, and that's the other thing, is you want to be sure that if you're doing this wholesaling, you're not just showing up and saying, okay, you're now selling. I mean, there's a series of documents that the Department of Revenue will tax this transaction twice if you do not follow the novation. So basically saying our first agreement is null and void between Joe and me, and Joe and my ultimate buyer are now going to enter into an agreement. And there's always that split second at the table where you terminated the one. What if Joe just says, well, I'm out of here? Yeah. Thanks, guys. Thanks for the 75K worth of improvements, and I'll see you later. That's a possibility. So there's risk there for the wholesaler as well. And this was not, it always is, isn't it? It is such a, I don't want to say brilliant, but it's a smart way to not have to pay transfer tax twice.
Yeah.
Really the liability comes back because the investor who's doing this doesn't have title to the property. They don't have the deed. So at any time, if that person dies, if it goes to the heirs, so there's some risk there. But I mean, it was almost, I don't know, again, not ingenious, but it was a very smart way to then facilitate a transaction as long as everybody was on the same page. And it's genuinely not trying to screw Joe out of getting what Joe's house is worth, right? That's the other thing. It's, hey, Joe, the house is only worth 100,000 right now. I'm putting money into it that you don't otherwise have. You can't get the loan. I'm going to do this to help you get it sold and then help me make some money at the same time.
I'm really glad that Pennsylvania decided to legislate this.
Yes.
Because it brings a process into the light that, if misunderstood or not handled appropriately, had a kind of a bad reputation.
Oh, yeah.
And it allows this to be treated properly because it was an industry that runs parallel to our industry and could have overtaken it.
It does.
If we didn't do it right.
And it's a lot of under served communities who are taken advantage of with this, that from,
Yeah.
at least from what we've seen several ethics hearings where, I shouldn't say several, we've seen some ethics hearings where a person will come in and say, you know, we went to a closing, we bought it, we thought we bought it, whatever, they gave us a key, and then we show up and someone's living in the property and there's all this other stuff, and it's like, well, you know, and, oh, it was wholesaled and this, that, and it was just this whole extravagant. And then we finally asked the agent, we're like, how long have you been in the business? And it was a few years. They had closed, I think it was 5 transactions, 4 of which were these wholesale deals. So their only experience outside of those wholesale deals was 1 transaction in real estate beyond that. And that's the downside, is that, not putting anybody down, but they watch these online videos that say, easy way to make money. Oh, here's a tutorial from some guy in Florida who's probably a convict. No, I'm just joking. But you know, is not somebody that I would readily be trusting with my money, let alone taking advice from a business perspective. But they watch this and they get these ideas and they start doing research. And that's the benefit with the internet, but also the downside is that there's a whole bunch of trash out there that's just wrong. And they get in there, and it's always like, and when I used to be at the DA's office, we always said, like, there's a decision. And then once that decision's made, there's another decision. And then a lot of times they are just so far down this path, they're just holding on thinking, oh God, I hope this thing works out. But to your point, I think we're a few years behind where we actually should have been in terms of the wholesaling, because there is just, the way that fraud can occur now is just incredible. We had a case where a virtual notary got done signing everything. Okay, so this is a notary who's not in the same area or in the same room as the signer. Validation, held up the ID, face, everything matched, signature matched. And at the end of their thing, after they had signed everything, they were saying, well, thank you very much. And the image froze of the person who signed. And when they went to like move their head, that person's face, it was AI who had impersonated the person on the driver's license. So they took a screenshot quickly. They were like, ma'am, is everything okay? And then all of a sudden there was just like, and it disconnected. They were able to get back. All the documents had been signed and sent to this woman. So they were able to get them back. They put the recorder's office on notice and everything. But I mean, this was a reputable, like the state of Pennsylvania has, I think, like 12 vendors that are authorized to use this. It was one of those authorized vendors. So it can happen, and it's a scary, scary thing. But I think as stuff develops and as people start to utilize that more and more, I just hope it's not the younger agents who are like, oh, this is going to be easy. Oh, I'll just, put this into ChatGPT or whatever and bump it out. But yeah, it's a scary, scary thing. So, but the wholesaling is definitely something that should have been tackled a while ago. Philadelphia has some really bad horror stories with that of transfers of people showing up to properties they thought they bought, and it's not for sale. There's all sorts of just rampant issues going on. So
It's happening a lot around here with land.
it is, yeah,
Hotel.
especially Adams County.
Yeah.
Adams County has a lot of that with vacant farmland. So there's billboards. I don't know if you ever drive by, some farmers have put up giant billboards right along the road that says, if you're here to buy this property, it is not for sale. Whomever got the contact information is a fraud, report it to the police. So yeah, I mean, they have finally gotten to the point where it's not just one, it is multiple people showing up to like, oh, we bought the, it's.
Well, and reporting it to
incredible.
the police is really hard. Are they local? Are these people far away?
Yep.
If it was coming from another country, I talked to somebody at the United States Department of State who investigates these frauds, and they said, can you prove that there was a passport involved? Because that's kind of my department. If it's not a passport, I can't help you.
Right.
So like finding someone who can actually police this activity is almost impossible.
Yeah, it's and especially the advanced AI stuff is typically out of a different country, and that's where the line kind of stops. And it's like, well, some of it is and then it's like sub-Saharan African nations and things like that. And it's kind of, what do you want us to go there and get them and physically, like, it's just not, there's nothing we can do. They don't extradite back here. And even if they did, there's no way to track that down. But that wire fraud, that the whole thing with fraud now is just incredible. It's title companies, it's everybody. So you really have to just kind of take a time out. We always used to verify with a photo ID and a picture or an audio and video. And even with that now, with the chat GPT and stuff, it's like you can impersonate anybody. So yeah, it's really making it hard to do your job, but yeah, keeps it fun. What are the questions you guys have, Manny?
Gosh, you are so informative. I just like.
Too much, too quick. I know, I
No,
apologize.
no,
That's off very fast.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I'm happy to come back out again in like another month or two, or whenever you guys want me to come out, and we'll see how things are going then. And
What are you doing tomorrow?
yeah.
the
What is tomorrow? It's a Friday. No, but honestly, if I can leave you with any, this is not meant to scare you at all. It is, if you were doing the job that you were supposed to be doing before all this, you really don't have to change anything. You don't, you're just not going to see your seller concession or your cooperative compensation in the MLS. Now you just have to pick up the phone and call people, hoping they get back to you. I know that's the big hope and the wish, but yeah. So, but it should be business as usual. But we'll see. Keep an eye on the cooperative compensation, and I'd be curious also to hear what your clients are saying. So pay attention to that about kind of the misinformation about, oh, I hear I don't have to pay you anymore, or stuff like that. It's pretty far out there. So, but thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it. And like I said, happy
Thank
to come
you.
back whenever. Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.